This is a Roqe Media series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 10. Hi there, and welcome to the Contemporary History of Iran, a series from Roqe Media. This is Part 10, The Persian Schindler. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. Our aim with this series is to explore the events, personalities, and issues that have shaped modern Iran. We want to do this as much as possible through a non-traditional lens, through snapshots of change, and using alternative voices or angles. This series is mostly in English and will feature a new episode posted every Thursday across our Roqe Media platforms. We will post subtitled excerpts with Farsi Zirnavis on our YouTube and Instagram sites. We are coming to you on roqemedia.com. It is there that you can link to all of our platforms, and we invite you to check out parts 1 through 9 of this series that are already posted. To become a sponsor or patron of Roqe Media, please contact us through our website. The Contemporary History of Iran is brought to you in part by Yazdani Law Group. YLG is one of the largest Iranian-Canadian immigration law firms. Their mission, rooted in the leadership of founder Afshin Yazdani, is built on continuously striving to innovate and introduce new immigration pathways for their clients. Afshin began his career as a lawyer and law professor in Iran, and his company has now made it their goal to provide the best, simplest, least risky, and most inexpensive way to immigrate to Canada. YLG has an impressive track record, hundreds of applications from Iran successfully processed every year. They are at YLGPC on Instagram. That is Yazdani Law Group. All right, let's get started. Here now is the Contemporary History of Iran, Part 10. Well, as we have previously suggested on this series, there are events and personalities of modern Iran that have been regularly covered or discussed by academics and those who shape the narratives of our history. The Shah, Khomeini, or the 1979 revolution come to mind. They are worthy subjects, of course, and there are moments or figures as well who are, as is often the case, viewed through a particular ideological lens in retrospect. But then there are Iranians in our history that deserve our attention from all sides and have only come into the public consciousness more recently due to the work of a certain academic or storyteller. On this episode of the Contemporary History of Iran, we want to look at just such a figure. You might say an Iranian hero who has long deserved recognition, albeit posthumously. Abdul Hossein Sardari was an Iranian diplomat whose lineage actually came from the Qajar royal family. He studied at the University of Geneva and graduated with a law degree in 1936. By 1942, Sardari was the Iranian consul general in Nazi-occupied Paris. There was a sizable community of Iranian Jews in Paris when German forces invaded and occupied the city. It was Sardari who would help thousands of Iranian and non-Iranian Jews escape the Holocaust. He did this at great personal risk. And in the process, the late Ambassador Sardari may have saved far more lives than Oskar Schindler, but he has received far less recognition in comparison. And indeed, Abdul Hossein Sardari died penniless and alone in the early 1980s, years after the Second World War and after the Iranian Revolution. To discuss the Persian Schindler, I'm joined on this episode by the man who is solely responsible for bringing the story of Sardari to international spotlight in his factual and dramatic book, In the Lion's Shadow. Dr. Fariborz Mokhtari is an historian and professor born in Iran in 1946. He's had an impressive career in academia as well as journalism and work for the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. To discuss the story of Sardari, the reasons behind a universal historical mission of the Sardari tale, and what motivated Dr. Mokhtari to pursue this fascinating story, I'm joined by Professor Fariborz Mokhtari in Vermont. Hello, sir.
Well, hello. How are you?
Listen, I'm very well. I'll be very honest. I very much enjoyed reading this book. I'm glad that I'm ashamed that bringing you on the program was my impetus to read it. I should have read it anyway. It's fascinating, and I thank you for it.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Professor Mokhtari, where did this extraordinary story start for you? How did it come upon your radar that there had been an Iranian responsible for saving Jewish lives during the Holocaust in France? Mm-hmm. And when did you know you wanted to make a book out of it?
This really goes back to my own upbringing. I lived in a family, an environment that really showed me the general tolerance that the Iranian culture has. And we lived, for instance, in an area where Jewish families were our neighbors. And from childhood, I had Jewish friends, and we would go to their houses, and they would come to our house and play. So this really was the background. And then later on, I had heard rumors that Iranian diplomats and officials had helped not only Jews, but various victims of Nazi oppression and so on. When I read something, I think it was a book about late Prime Minister Hoveyda by Professor Abbas Milani. There was a reference to a diplomat who had helped Jews in France. I called his publisher, and through the publisher, I got in touch with him. And he gave me the names of a few people who had told him that. So I contacted those people. And finally, I was meeting a friend of mine from high school. We were in New Jersey at his home, and I mentioned that I have this story, but I don't have eyewitnesses. His wife, God bless her, said in a very friendly manner, "You dummies, you have a classmate from Alborz High School whose wife was in France at the time." So we called him. The gentleman's name is Majid Azizi. We called Majid. Majid came over. He lives in New Jersey too, and he brought his wife. And through that, we made a few telephone calls to her relatives in Los Angeles, and the whole thing started. The ball started rolling.
You know, the story is so fantastic. The story of Sardari, this man, who ends up saving these Jewish lives in 1942 in France and through the Second World War. It's the kind of thing that I can imagine Iranians telling each other over the dinner table, or it's almost like this mythical story that we would tell. Tell me about it takes a lot to write a book like this about a subject that hasn't even been codified, that hasn't even been realized before historically, that you know that you're going to go and have to do the primary research and bring this story to light. Tell me about why that was so important to you. I mean, you say you grew up with Jewish friends in Iran, but why go embark on this journey?
Well, deep down, I knew that our culture really had this very basic tolerance in it. It is embedded in our culture. So deep down, I wanted this story to be true. I actually was convinced that it was true. When I started digging evidence, and I went to National Archives and met people and talked to the people, it gave me such a feeling of satisfaction that it confirmed my belief in tolerance. So it was a labor of love in a manner of speaking, and it took a long time. It took several years to do this, but it was very satisfying.
Why were you so convinced that Iranians have this tolerance. You talk about the neighbors when you were born after the Second World War, but you were born into a military family and you grew up in a mixed neighborhood that included many Iranian Jews. Where did the idea come from that, I mean, it's a laudable one, and I would hope this would be the case, but that Iranians practice such tolerance?
Well, some of it I had seen, in my own family, my extended family. When I was about 2.5, 3 years old, we were visiting my grandparents, on my mother's side in Kermanshah. And one day, my grandfather called his a butler, a person who would take care of the household affairs, and told him his name was Nazir Khan. So Nazir Khan, go to the neighbor's house and turn on the lights, start the fire in their kitchen. And I thought, why does somebody have to go to somebody else's house to turn on the lights? And later on, I found out that this was a Saturday and they were Orthodox Jews. And they were neighbors. Later on, of course, we had our own Jewish neighbors. On top of that, we had relatives who had gone abroad, for instance, and married and come back with wives who were Christian or of different nationality, French, German, and so on. I also remember we had a family member on my mother's side from Kurdistan, but he was married to a beautiful, stunningly beautiful lady who happened to be Jewish. There were things like this that convinced me that all the things that I had heard about tolerance, and later on, of course, by reading history, this was confirmed.
So the theme of this book, or the turning point, the trick to saving lives, was for Abdul Hossein Sardari to do something quite remarkable, and that's to convince the Germans that Jewish people from Iran, Iranian Jews, were somehow different from non-Iranian Jews. How did he do that, and why would the Germans fall for it?
Two basic reasons. One of them is the absurdity and inconsistency in the German racial policy, their ideology of dividing people by races and by blood and stuff of that sort really doesn't cut the scientific muster. It just doesn't do it. So Sardari exploited that. At the same time, Sardari had a command of several languages, French and German, Persian and English. He had gone to boarding school in England since he was 7 years old, and he had a legal education. And therefore, he had this skill to pose questions or propose ideas that would make people stop and think, even if they were not convinced, they hesitated, and he cultivated this. He would pose these questions and write to various officials. And the Germans, really, I would classify the Germans into several groups. There were some Germans who were of old families and didn't really like the Nazis. One of them, for instance, was the first secretary at the German embassy in France. He was a friend of Sardari. He would help him out. Then you had some people in the official Ministry of Foreign Affairs or various other places who were careerists. They had joined the Nazi Party in 1933, and they wanted advancement. And therefore, they towed the line because they wanted to go to higher places, better positions and salaries and so on. And then there were another group who were true believers in the ideology and followed it blindly. The division among these people helped Sardari to pose the questions, and what he would write would go from one group to another group to another group, and in many cases would end up in centers for study of race and things of that sort.
His argument was quite astounding. I mean, it's almost absurd on the face of it. It says that somehow the Jews that were coming from Iran were Aryan and not Semites, and so they're different. But again, as you say, he is exploiting the actual absurdity of Nazi laws or notions of racially dividing people into groups and discriminating against them in horrific ways. Where would the argument come from that these are Aryans and not Semites? How did he make that case?
He went back to history, and he said Cyrus the Great freed the Jews from Babylon and helped them go back to their homes, in fact, helped them to build their temples and so on. Therefore, the Jews left Iran. But some of the Iranians of Aryan stock, who your cousins, Germans, they liked the teachings of Prophet Moses, and they followed some of the teachings. And Sardari turned up in French, he wrote mosaics. These are followers of Moses. Therefore, he argued that these are not, from a racial perspective or from blood perspective, they are not Jewish. They are Aryan, they are Persian, of Aryan stock, but they just happen to follow some of the teachings of Moses. In addition to that, in fact, I think you brought this up, there was a political aspect to this too.
Yes, which is, I guess you're alluding to the idea that that the Germans, in some cases, whether they believed this case that Sardari was making or not, they wanted to keep good relations with the Iranians for the purposes of the Second World War.
Yes, Iran was crucial to them. Again, the best example is a gentleman called von der Schulenburg. Schulenburg had been ambassador to Iran, minister to Iran. And therefore, one of the letters went to Schulenburg to inquire whether Sardari's claim was true or not. Now, Schulenburg responded, I have the quotation here. This is Schulenburg writing. This is translation from German. As I recall, the Juguten, I refer to either mosaics or Juguten, which is a play on the German Juden for Jew.
Yeah.
As I recall, the Juguten constitute a Muslim sect that essentially follows Mohammedan principles. The scope of the theology of Moses that they have adopted is very limited. On the basis of blood, they are Iranian, not Semite. Therefore, applying the German Jewish laws to them seems unjustified. We are trying, despite all the difficulties facing us, to maintain our good relations with Iran. Prejudice against Juguten will defeat our efforts and will give our enemies propaganda ammunition to use against us. The Political Bureau 13 of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs recommends not applying the laws of German Jews to Juguten, or at the very least, postponing the implementation. This is a direct quote from a letter that he has written.
Not so subtle. There's clearly a political motive there. The interesting part, if it's heroic that Sardari is using these arguments, using his charisma, using his speaking skills and his facility with languages to make the case to save these Jewish lives of Iranian Jews in France, it's real heroism when he also does this to save other Jews who aren't Iranian, but he makes the case that they are Iranian for the sake of saving them. Can you tell us about that part of the story?
Yes, again, that's a very interesting point. And there are two sides to that. One is that he had created a network. You see, the Germans were not satisfied with one document. They wanted multiple documents in order to be convinced that something was, as claimed. So Sardari had to create a network. He would issue a document. Well, because of this network that he created, there was a great deal of trust. And therefore, his Jewish friends would come to him, Jewish Iranian friends, and say, we have non-Iranian partners, business partners, or we have married to non-Iranians. And Sardari would try to help them out. Now, the other side of this issue is that, according to Iranian laws, the cabinet of any government in Iran has the authority, legal authority, to give citizenship to any person who makes a commitment to serve the national interest of Iran. The person would say, I wish to donate a hospital or build a hospital or a school or do something of that sort. in a location in Iran. And Sardari would use this as a provision to send a letter to the government in Iran, to the cabinet, to request an application for this guy receiving Iranian citizenship. So he really wasn't above the law. There was a legal provision for doing this. But he did that, and he did it with quite a bit of success.
Given that he prosecutes, that he presides over these, the saving these lives, it makes it all the more heartbreaking, this story, when he, after the Second World War, towards the end of it and afterwards, he becomes basically this lonely, isolated man who is neither accepted in Germany nor in Iran, despite what he has done, and over the years becomes relatively unknown, only to die after the Iranian Revolution in exile, lonely and without very much money. It's in some ways as inspiring as the tale of this Iranian Schindler, Abdul Hossein Sardari is. It's quite a sad story, isn't it?
It is a very sad story. He had a very unpleasant childhood. His father had passed away at a very young age. He was sent to England at the age of 7. His mother basically neglected him. Sardari was basically left with the servants to be taken care of, and at the age of 7 was sent to England. So as a child, he really was deprived of that love and affection of the parents. Then later on, when he was in Paris, he fell in love with a young lady from China who was an opera singer. Her parents had sent her to France to study music. He referred to her affectionately as Chin Chin. When the civil war in China started, Chin Chin went to visit her parents and disappeared. Nobody heard from her again. So Sardari lost his, love of his life. And then after the war, he was accused of having misappropriated some of the funds that Iran had sent to France to purchase arms and ammunition for the army. And of course, he couldn't do that during the war. During the war, you couldn't purchase arms and ammunition and send it to Iran. So he was accused of not having done his duty or misappropriating the funds when Iran stopped sending money to France after Iran declared war on Germany. And then it was during the government of Prime Minister Mossadegh, the foreign minister had an axe to grind against him. That's another story in itself.
If you fast forward to the end of the Shah and the Iranian Revolution, why does at that point Sardari raise the ire of the new regime in Iran?
Well, because he was the nephew of Prime Minister Hoveyda,
right?
And of course, he was accused of all sorts of things because of that association. After the war, he was detained for 10 days or so, and then Ambassador Sepahbudi, who had known him and worked with him in both Switzerland and France, went to Prime Minister Ahmad Qavam. Qavam went to the Shah, and Shah issued a royal pardon. He was allowed to come out of detention and rehabilitated. He went to the embassy, Iranian embassy in Iraq, but after the coup d'etat in Iraq, when they overthrew the monarchy, then he returned to Iran and left the foreign ministry and joined the Iranian oil company. An oil company sent him to England. He was in England until the revolution.
So it's fair to say that when Abdul Hossein Sardari was living his final days with little material goods and basically alone in England, it's fair to say that he wouldn't have guessed at that point that 20 years later people would be talking about him as a hero, as a product of a acclaimed book.
Not at all. No, he was not only he was a modest man, he didn't think he had done anything special. And actually, there are two very examples to illustrate this. One of them is that I think it was in late 60s or 70s, he received a letter from Yad Vashem in Israel that we have heard you helped the Jews during the war. And his response, I actually saw that letter, his response. It's a short, very short letter, 2 lines. It was, well, thank you very much for your kind notice and letter, but I simply performed my duty. It was my duty to look after Iranians, and I did so. And signed. That was it. So this is one example that shows he didn't think he had done anything special. Another example, I have mentioned this in my book again. There was a ceremony in Los Angeles at the Simon Wiesenthal Center. And at that ceremony, Sardari was mentioned, and his nephew and late Ambassador Feridun Hoveyda was there. Hoveyda said after the war, he went to France, and he just happened to walk into the apartment of his uncle, Sardari, and he saw a group of people there they are giving him a silver plate inscribed things thanking him. And he realized that these are the leaders of the Jewish community in Paris who have come to thank him, and they are giving him this silver plate as a sort of gesture of thanks. He said, as soon as these people left, I got excited. I said, Uncle, I'm going to call the newspapers and let people know and so on. And he said, in his word, he astonished. He said, you never do anything of the sort. Oh. I said, Uncle, why not? He said, because I simply performed my duty. And he said, Uncle, some of these were not Iranian. They were French. And he said, well, and that was my duty to God. That was it.
Wow. But, even though he was that humble, the story is so important and so astounding. Why is it that, unlike Oskar Schindler, not to take anything away from Schindler, of course, but I mean, that was a hit film and book, and the entire world knows his name. We can use him as a reference here. Why is it that Sardari is so little known around the world?
Well, part of it is, of course, his own modesty. Part of it is that a lot of people simply don't know, and part of it is political. There are lots of people in Israel who know this story. They have read the book. In fact, there's a magazine a monthly magazine in Israel that has published parts of this book on a monthly basis.
It's very well received in Israel, as I understand it, right? You've been invited on more than one occasion to discuss your work there.
Yeah. But for political reasons, there are political officials, politicians, who find it to their advantage to have bad relations between Iran and Israel. So there are lots of Israelis and Jewish leaders in the United States and England and France who would like Sardari to receive official recognition. But so far, Yad Vashem has not come through.
Well, there's an article I read from a couple of years ago in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, and the story was that Sardari had not been honored by Yad Vashem's Righteous Among the Nations because the museum said it didn't have enough evidence. So how much do you think, as you say, political, how much do you think right-wing politicians such as former Prime Minister Netanyahu have a bearing on Ambassador Sardari's posthumous recognition?
Well, I have my suspicion. I don't have the facts, but there are things that I can tell you. One is that photocopies of all the documents I found at the National Archives, which are copies of the German documents, I sent those to Yad Vashem. In fact, they were hand-delivered to Yad Vashem. When I wrote my book, I took a copy of my book and I went to Yad Vashem in person and I gave it to them. At one point, the head of Yad Vashem asked me for an affidavit from Ambassador Hoveyda, Feridun Hoveyda, about the things that he had testified. And I went to Hoveyda and I got that official, and we stamped it and did all the official things, and I sent it to Yad Vashem. After a while, I got a letter that we have not received it. So I did this again for a second time, special mail and so on. I think each time it cost me over $29 or so to do this. So the idea that they don't have the documents is something that I have a hard time accepting.
Somebody who is actually a friend of mine that I was telling about this, who said that he had heard somewhere that Sardari's name will be added to Yad Vashem this year. Do you know anything about that?
I don't, but I know that there was a ceremony in New York not long ago, and one of the people there was actually Sardari's neighbor who bought Sardari's condo. He was in New York, and he actually initiated a second sort of attempt to have this man recognized. The former head of Yad Vashem at the time was in New York, and he tried to lend a helping hand.
What are the reactions that have meant the most to you? Especially when you talk about going to Israel and hearing from Israelis of Iranian descent, let's say, or not of Iranian descent, or people in the Iranian diaspora. What have you really treasured in terms of the way people have reacted to this story and your book?
Well, the Iranians in general feel very proud of this. It gives a feeling of, has an uplifting, inspirational sort of feeling that our culture is a culture of tolerance. We're nice people, we're good people. Unlike what you hear in the media about Iran at the moment and Iranians. In Israel, Iranians who are in Israel, who migrated to Israel, they of course love the story, and they feel very moved by it. So it's been positive all around. Now, having said that, there are a few people who said, "Oh, well, he did this for money." All the evidence shows that this was not the case. The survivors, for instance, clearly say that this was not the case. In fact, Sardari used his own private means during the time he was in France to continue helping his friends until the end of the war, because his salary had been cut after Iran declared war on Germany.
Has anyone approached you about making a film of this story?
Yes. Several people have done that. None of them have succeeded so far. 2 other people are still involved. The major issue has been raising enough money to do the project.
Right.
Documentaries have been made, but a big screen movie.
Would you want a big screen movie version of this book?
I would love to see it, yeah. And I would love people to see it. It would be wonderful if that would happen.
Before I let you go, I'm very grateful to get to talk to you about this book. It quite moved me. Let me ask you a little bit about your story, because it's no less interesting to a certain extent. You were born in the 1940s in Iran. You came west first before the revolution and studied in America. You then returned to Iran, and your second and final departure from Iran was much more stressful and coincided with the storming of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and around the revolution. How did you manage to leave in the post-revolutionary havoc? Tell me about that time.
Well, I came to the United States as soon as I graduated from high school, Alborz High School. And I studied in the United States after I got my master's degree in international relations, political science and international relations. I returned to Iran. It was early 1970. And of course, I had studied. I had no intention of staying in the United States. I'd come to study and go back. I went back to Iran. I was attending a wedding, actually, and I found myself standing next to Dr. Wazza, the publisher of Qajar. And just to making small talk, I said I was the editor of a campus newspaper when I was studying in the United States. He said, "Oh, in that case, you have to come and work for me." So I went to Qajar. I started working for Qajar as a journalist. After the revolution, I think 9 months after the revolution, I left Iran. At that time, I was also the deputy executive director of the Irano-British Chamber of Commerce. There was a meeting in London and I could attend that meeting. So I left with a very small briefcase with a change of clothes and $4,000. That was the limit you could take with you. So I left for London, and from London I went to the United States because a professor of mine had offered me a fellowship. My wife is from Thailand. We met in college in the United States. Our eldest son was born in the United States. My wife, of course, being Thailand, she had an Iranian passport and a Thai passport. My son had an American passport, the eldest son. My youngest son was only 2 years old, was born in Tehran. So they went to Thailand in order to join me in the United States from there. But by that time, hostages had been taken, and President Carter had issued an executive order not to give visas to Iranians. So my 2-year-old son in diapers was a persona non grata, couldn't get a visa to come to the United States.
Right.
So I went to the office of Senator Biden. I went to his office in Wilmington, Delaware, and I told the story to the lady who was in his office.
Right.
A couple of days later, I got a telephone call from my wife from Bangkok, Thailand. And she said, we just got a telephone call from the embassy, U.S. Embassy. And the person said, Madam, we don't know what kind of influence you have in Washington, but your son's visa is ready.
Wow. Let me ask you one final question.
Sure.
In the prologue to your book, Professor Mokhtari, you say something revelatory, which is the following. You say, Iran has fallen upon hard times more than once, but has managed to rise up time and again. What has assured the nation's survival has been its profound cultural consciousness. What do you mean by that?
You know, there really is a profound understanding that there is a difference between right and wrong, what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, between beauty and ugliness. You see manifestations of this everywhere. If you really look at Persian art, there really is something that not only recognizes what is right, what is wrong, what is nice, what is not nice, what is beautiful, what is not, but there is also something embedded in this, which is optimism. You know, there is optimism that you create beauty, you make something that is better, you create perfection. You will never get there. You might never reach perfection, but you try. So this is part of the culture. Look at the Persian poetry. I mean, there are so many poems about tolerance, about humanity.
What you're saying is so beautiful that I hate to pour any cold water on it. but optimism in our community in the contemporary sense sometimes feels like a stretch. It feels like the opposite. It feels like we feel like the badbacht people. We feel like there's so much to be sad about, so much to be upset about, so much to mourn. And so it's an interesting twist to say that we see the beauty in everything, or that we can be optimistic.
Well, again, if you look at the, let's say, not only poetry, but music and the songs, there's also that sadness, but redemption. You know, that magical bird will rise again out of fire. You know, there is that optimism.
Are you optimistic about the future of Iranians, if not Iran?
Most definitely, yes. The best way to put it is, we have had a pendulum effect. You know, the pendulum went from one side to the other side. Now it's going to go back, and eventually we're going to have that equilibrium as all pendulums finally reach, you know.
Professor Mokhtari, I can't tell you how much of a pleasure it's been. And the opportunity to speak to you is something I very much appreciate, and your time and your patience. Thank you for this today.
Well, thank you. This was delightful. I appreciate it very much.
Hope to see you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Dr. Fariborz Mokhtari, the author of the book In the Lion's Shadow, The Iranian Schindler and His Homeland in the Second World War. Fariborz Mokhtari joined us from Vermont. This is full time for the Roqe Media series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 10. brought to you with the support of Yazdani Law Group, one of Canada's largest immigration law firms, YLGPC, on Instagram. Please check out our regular editions of Roqe and all things related at roqemedia.com. That's our website, roqemedia.com, where you can also find out information about becoming a sponsor or a patron. Thanks to the team who make Roqe Media happen. Producer Susan, talented Anahita, Super Patty Saw, Ponta the artist, the fabulous Keon, Savi Roham, Ahaya Mehtad, Captain Reza, and Groovy Shaya. Thank you to all of you out there for supporting us and sharing our content. Please subscribe if you have not done so already. Find me on Instagram at Jian Ghomeshi. Mizun Bashin.